Hi everyone. Sarah's observations from last class really stuck with me, and I've been noodling, aka reflecting, on it. You'll recall that Sarah had watched a class where the students sat in a circle and each would read as much as he or she chose, and then the next student would pick up. And I suggested that there were a couple of issues with what she saw, and I want to talk a little bit more about them while I remember. Well, I don't want to talk about them, but I want to talk about how we should present reading aloud in our classes. The first thing, and we said some of this last class, we have to make it clear to students that we realize it is a challenge for some of them to read aloud, and that reading aloud can be awkward and frightening. But it is a requirement of the world out there, unless you're some kind of kooky hoarder, and homebound, and then you have bigger fish to fry. So we need to know that it's a skill they need to master, and that you have created a safe place, right? So all is well for them to begin to learn or feel more comfortable with reading aloud. You also need to remind students that there are two parts to this activity, the reading and the listening, and both are active. Listening requires real focus and intent. It's easy to let your mind wander, and then you miss something. And unlike a written text, you can't always go back to see what you missed, and then essentially you're screwed. And there are many things that you can do to help them when it comes to reading aloud, and I want to give you a couple of examples. First, preview the reading. Indicate what it's about. What's the context? Who's the author? Review the text and identify what information you can provide that will make it easier for them both to follow and to understand what they are learning. But the key there is you've got to review the text before you assign the reading. In this same vein, preview vocabulary. Tell them there might be new words they've never encountered or unfamiliar words, which are those they may have heard but never seen. Take a look at some of these with them before you start the reading, like a vocabulary lesson. Vocabulary in context, what a novel idea. Then, my practice is to make these 2 points. First, I tell them that if they see a word they don't know, they should pause and ask me. And second, if I hear them mispronounce a word, I will stop them and explain what's up. I try to avoid saying I'm going to stop and correct you, because I don't think it's an error if they don't know the word. In reading, as in every single thing you do as a teacher, you must set a purpose. Your world as a teacher revolves around being purposeful in all that you do. Now, that does not mean you have students look for specific points or for information. You don't want them thinking about answers to questions. You want them listening holistically. So you establish a broad purpose, but you must, in all you do, explain why you are doing it. Why are we reading this? How does it fit into what we are studying? What does it have to do with our essential questions or our global or content goals for the unit? And think about what I've had you read so far, the 2 This American Lives. And in your head begin to wonder, how would I set a purpose for this? What would be the purpose I would set for this? Just keep that in mind as you look at the various things that we will read this semester. Always practice. What would the purpose be that I would establish? Remember, just because we don't take a look at the purpose of everything we read, or just because we don't practice all of these skills with every text we encounter in our methods class, doesn't mean you shouldn't be thinking about them through the lens of being a teacher. I suggest you break the reading up into passages or chunks. So you take a text and you count down a certain number of lines, and you have the students in their text mark that section with a pencil lightly and number it, section 1. Do that to the entire document. Now you can have some longer and some shorter passages. So one passage might run 10 lines and another only 5. And then when you call on readers, you keep those sections in mind. Your kids who are terrified read a shorter section. The kid who's more confident can read a longer one. So let me explain that this is not as complicated as it sounds. I'm not saying you count sentences, just lines. So from the top of a page, count down 10 or whatever number. Have students read to the closest period and then stop. The next kid might start in the middle of a line, but that's cool because they're paying attention. It's not like, oh, where do I start? Do you see what I mean, or am I completely confusing you? I can show you on the Elmo in class. Anyway, call on students randomly. Otherwise, they read ahead trying to prepare and they don't pay attention. Finally, you must check for understanding. During the reading, pause after the chunks to check and make sure students are following. Don't ask close-end questions, does everybody get this? Or show me with a number of fingers how many of you are understanding it. They're going to lie. So you want to ask probing questions. Ask for a summary of what was read. Ask how the passage fits in terms of the purpose you established. Ask how the passage builds from a previous passage. Or ask what they think might be coming and why. Don't spend a ton of time here if it seems like they're following, because the idea of the flow is not just about silent reading, it's about reading aloud, and you don't want to interrupt the flow, but you do need to make sure that students are comprehending what they're reading. And this comprehension is especially important when they are listening. And remember, like all we do, there is a learning process, and the learning plan from our lesson plans can be really helpful here. So you want to model reading aloud for your students. Show them how you sound when you read, and show them how you self-monitor. And pause after the portion you read to ask yourself some comprehension questions. Show them what that looks like. You know, I was just reading this book on learning called Elements of Learning, which is written by the same guys who wrote Elements of Teaching, which we will read in 402, and which some of you have already read in 402. Anyway, the authors were explaining that the difference between high school and college, and actually the difference between middle school and high school, and actually between the first 2 years of high school and the last 2 years of high school. So it's during those last 2 years of high school and the first years of college that students become more and more responsible for their own learning. That means they need to know how to think about, reflect on, engage with, analyze, or what I like to say, think hard about what they read. And they have to learn to do that on their own. They have to become self-sufficient, self-sustaining readers. And you know, you can use the whole group to engage in choral reading, where everybody reads aloud together. Have the class choose a passage, or you choose a passage, assign it to the class, and everybody reads it at the same time. You can see how some students might stumble over vocabulary or unfamiliar words. You can listen for tone. When they're finished, ask them how they would think hard or reflect on that reading. What would they ask themselves? And there's lots of permutations of this. You can have half the room read one passage and the other half of the room read the other passage and comment on how each group read. It's really open to all kinds of variations on this activity. But think about it. For students who are uncomfortable reading with all those people around them, it's like me singing. I love to go to Christmas Eve Mass because I love to sing Christmas carols. And as you can imagine, just listening to me, I have an atrocious, tone-deaf, annoying voice. But man, I can belt it out when I'm in a group of other people singing. I was just never allowed to sing in chorus because I sucked so much. So at church, they can't throw you out. They can't say you suck because that's like anti-God. So I can sing to my heart's content. Would you like to hear me sing a little bit for you? Okay, I won't. You might remember as class was ending the last time that Nick mentioned he saw this cool small group whisper reciprocal reading. And I think, if I'm remembering it correct, it was where two students took turns reading aloud. But they were reading whisperingly, so they didn't disturb the rest of the class. Anyway, you can do that with larger groups, but I think 2 or 3 are the best. And here, too, you establish the length of the passages. So you have the small groups read the passage, and give them 2 passages, so one kid reads in the other, unless they're in threes, then you have 3 passages. You're getting the picture. And when all are done, the whole class can discuss any words they struggled with as a class. So this way, it's not like the independent. So you've got everybody doing the discussion. And you can see if some groups can help other groups with words that might not have known or that might have been unfamiliar to them. Then you can have them answer some reflective questions back in their groups and then come back to the whole class and share those answers with the class. And this is also a way to begin to group your students a little bit with some of your stronger students who might be able to help some of the weaker students, not your strongest and your weakest. Remember, we talked about that. But the idea that you can use the students to support each other. Or if you feel like you've got a group that's really struggling, you can put all the other groups together in their middle or high ability performance levels, and then you can sit and work closely with those students who struggle to read aloud or who are simply terrified. And then finally, you can have independent practice, which takes the form of individual students reading aloud for the class. The thing to remember is this: you must teach reading. Never assume students can read simply because they can string together words in a sentence, and don't mistake fluency for comprehension. So all of the things that I've talked about in this little chat are designed to help you teach reading aloud, but that's different from teaching reading. So think about the idea of teaching reading in your EDRD 340 class, and we'll talk a little bit about it during the course of the semester. Okay, cool. Enjoy the rest of your weekend.